Hello, dear friends. 32 years ago now, I had a couple of meditation experiences over, I think, an Easter weekend, which persuaded me that life has no beginning and no end. Sometime around then, I described these experiences, these two meditation experiences, to a friend. And she suggested that I write it down for publication just as it is. This is something I never got round to doing simply because I think I didn't have confidence that it would be published. But yesterday it occurred to me that, well, since I upload daily shorts to YouTube, maybe I can publish via YouTube my experience in a YouTube video. So here it is. I was interested 32 years ago, quite passionately actually, in Buddhism. I thought I was really impressed one day about 36 years ago when I read an introduction to the Dhammapada by Eknath Easwaran, I think, in which he described the Buddha's teaching, and I totally loved its secular nature, that it did not rely on any kind of deity in its Theravada sense, in its old school sense, or possibly original sense. In its original sense, the Buddha's teaching, or the person described as the Buddha, whether he existed or not, it was or an author writing a story, whatever it is, but definitely I was impressed by his teaching as explained by Eknath Easwaran, explaining the Four Noble Truths and the Noble Eightfold Path, in which there was no reference whatsoever. I was impressed that there was no reference whatsoever to a deity. That Easwaran explained, oh, by the way, I've gone off track here. I'm talking about the origins of my meditation, not entirely off track, but somewhat long-winded. I didn't intend to do that. So when I discovered that the Buddha was basically, according to Eknath Easwaran, saying that life is change, and change cannot satisfy desire. And then the Buddha put forth the Four Noble Truths and the Noble Eightfold Path as a way to minimize pain and, by extension, maximize joy. And I thought, oh, this is really lovely. A human being who is explaining a way of life that does not rely in any shape or form on a deity. Now, just as an aside, later Buddhism, Mahayana Buddhism as it's called, then introduced the concepts of bodhisattvas and sort of deities. But I don't believe it existed in the original teaching. But anyhow, so I then became interested in Buddhism, and I came across a book by somebody called Thich Nhat Hanh, and became very enamored of his books, and finally went to Plum Village where he lived at the time, and went on retreat there. But even before I went to Plum Village to see him and hear him talk and so forth, I was very much enamored of his books. And I had read that the Buddha, from other books about Buddhism, that the Buddha had taught that there is no birth and no death. And that sort of had at the time totally puzzled me. So when I came across in, I think, The Miracle of Mindfulness, one of Thich Nhat Hanh's books, when I came across a meditation on one's own death, I thought, aha, maybe that will be an opportunity for me to understand what the Buddha meant by no birth, no death. And in fact, I was encouraged in doing so because in another book of Thich Nhat Hanh's called Touching Peace, he said at one point that the greatest gift, as I recall, that the greatest gift that the Buddha had given to humanity was his teaching on deathlessness. So I really wanted to understand what the Buddha meant by no birth and no death. So I thought on that Easter day that I would do the meditation on my own death, which was explained in another of Thich Nhat Hanh's books called The Miracle of Mindfulness, short sort of instruction on how to perform the meditation on one's own death. And so I followed the instructions. I think from memory, the instructions were something like lie down in a comfortable position on the floor in a warm space, whatever. And I forget how comfort was addressed, whether he said to put a pillow on your back and so forth. But anyhow, I lay down in a comfortable position, in a warm position, in the lounge back then, and started a meditation on my own death. And it starts quite cheerfully. Follow your breathing, breathe and smile. Now, I'm mentioning from memory that meditation. Imagine these circumstances of your death, who was around, etc. I can't remember exactly the details, but really to visualize, to imagine the moment in which I die. And I duly imagined that happening. I don't recall there being anyone around when I died of a heart attack or something, and of natural causes, as it were. And then he says, imagine your body 1 week after you have died. And then he goes on, he says, imagine your body some years after you have died, and so forth. And then he says, go on until there is no trace of you. And then he goes on to say, continue breathing and smiling. Gradually move your limbs and gradually prepare to get up again. So, from my lying position. So I did that. And in that meditation, which was the first of two meditations, effectively covering no death, I'll come to the second meditation presently, but I did that first meditation, and here is what happened during that meditation. It was quite amazing. I'll describe what happened here. During the first meditation, the meditation on no death, effectively, on my own death, I imagined myself dying. Okay, and I imagined myself being dead. I imagined my body being buried. At the time, I hadn't thought of cremation. I subsequently did a meditation on cremation with the same results, but or gave thought to contemplated cremation and with the same results that I had had in my meditation on no death years earlier, I think, or sometime earlier. But anyhow, I imagined myself being buried in a coffin. And true to Thich Nhat Hanh's advice, I imagined my body years afterwards. Years afterwards, the coffin had rotted and my body was being eaten, surprise, surprise, by worms. I should say at this point that although I used to fish with worms in Egypt as a child, I'd go with a friend to the banks of the River Nile, and having picked worms, handled worms with my own hands from our garden, I'd take worms as bait. I was a bad boy in those days, doing things like that. Now I don't like the idea of killing any animal, though I do sometimes. I forget which animal I am willing to kill. I don't even kill flies, actually, but anyhow, so back to the topic. I would handle these worms with my hands without any real disgust or anything like that, and would use them, cut the worms up and put them on hooks, on a hook, as bait for fish on the Nile. We'd hire a boat. We wouldn't go out on the boat. We'd just hire the use of a boat moored by the banks of the Nile and sit on the boat and fish from that boat as children. So I had no disgust of handling worms, but when I meditated, but at a deeper level, I had a disgust of worms because I knew as a child, I had visualized that one day I hadn't visualized it too clearly, but I just had the concept of death being my body being eaten by worms, etc. And I thought, what a disgusting life, the life of a worm under the earth, not seeing light, etc. I had conceived of a worm's life as quite a disgusting form of life. But anyhow, that day, 32 years ago, when I meditated my own death and imagined my body being eaten by worms, Thich Nhat Hanh's instruction was, continue till there's no trace of you. So I thought, okay, bits of my body are now, remember I was breathing and smiling, trying to breathe and smile through this meditation, be conscious of my breathing and to smile. I thought, okay, so bits of my body are being eaten by worms. What happens now? What's next? There's still me, bits of me. There's still a trace of me. There are bits of me inside a worm. And that's when I had my first, if you like, real transformation, actually two transformations at this worm stage. The first and very real transformation, second is a secondary one. First transformation was that it occurred to me that I had then become, in that meditation, bits of me had become part of a worm. Tiny bits of me had become part of the body of a worm. So effectively, I realized that worm's consciousness was sustained by the flesh, the rotting flesh it had just eaten, my flesh, that I was effectively part of that worm's consciousness. And that was quite a realization, because I realized that there's nothing intrinsically disgusting about being a worm, that as a worm, now I identified with the worm, that as a worm, all I needed, I had become part of a worm and part of the consciousness of a worm. As a worm, all I needed was simply nice, moist earth, nice, moist, nutritious, as far as I was concerned, earth, as the worm feeds on the minerals or whatever in the earth and the moisture in the earth. Nice, moist earth. And I'm happy. I don't need eyes. I don't need to see. All I need is to get my food and be happy. And so as a worm, I can be quite a happy worm given the conditions, given nice, moist earth and so forth. And that was a secondary realization that there's nothing intrinsically disgusting, a minor realization about being a worm. But then I thought, Thich Nhat Hanh's instruction was continue till there's no trace of you. So I thought, okay, what happens now? I'm a worm, so what's next? And I imagined myself, as worms do, coming up to the surface of the earth. I don't know the scientific reason they do that, but for some reason or other, coming up to the surface of the earth, and lo and behold, being gobbled up by a morning bird, because I had seen with my own eyes birds in our garden pick worms, and also in somebody else's garden many years later, when I was helping them dig out their garden, I'd seen birds, robins, perching themselves near my spade as I was digging out a part of the garden in happy expectation of a worm being uncovered, and actually robins going for worms and gobbling them up. So I imagined myself being, lo and behold, when I went to the surface of the earth at one point, that particular worm being gobbled up by a bird. Thich Nhat Hanh said, continues till there's no trace of you. And so I thought, okay, so now my flesh, the rotting flesh, which was eaten by the worm and had become part of the worm which I became, or that part of me became, had been gobbled up by a bird and was then now part of a bird. And I thought, and the same thought process occurred, that I am now effectively part of the energy of that bird, the consciousness of that bird, that having just gobbled up a worm, I imagined the bird chirping merrily, it had just had a nice meal, whatever, if birds chirp after a meal or just fly away, whatever. But I imagined myself chirping merrily, being happier that I'd just gobbled up a worm as a bird. And at that point, I thought I could go on forever. That bird will die and its body will be transformed into other forms of life and so forth. And that cycle of life goes on without end, infinitely. And at that point, I thought I'd done the meditation, which I indeed had successfully. I discovered that there is no death, that my body will go on infinitely in an infinite number of new forms, as part of an infinite number of life forms in future, in an infinity of matter, energy, and consciousness. And so I, continued breathing and smiling and moved my limbs as suggested, and very gradually got up, having realized that there is no death. I think about 2 or 3 days later, in that same bank holiday weekend, I had thought, well, how about no birth? And so I thought, this time I didn't lie down, I just sat on the floor next to my bed in my bedroom on that day and thought, why don't I just contemplate no birth? What does the Buddha mean by no birth? So I then did the opposite. I went back in time to the moment of my conception, and then, the moment of my birth, so many years ago. At the time, it would have been 38 or 39 years earlier. I imagined the moment of my birth, and then went back in time, imagined that I was being born. I was still in the womb. And then I went back in time and imagined myself being in the womb and growing in the womb. And then I went back in time and imagined the moment of conception, the moment my father's sperm entered my mother's egg. And I realized at one point I was two. I was not one. I was the egg, and I was also my father's sperm swimming towards the egg. So I went back in time with my father's part being sperm in my father's A sperm. That successful sperm, I was not a twin or a triplet or anything, so it was a single sperm that penetrated the egg. I imagined being that unknowingly successful sperm sitting in my father's testes. Of course, at the point of success, I lost my tail and my heads became part of the egg, which was my mother's egg. So I, as it were, united with the egg and became part of the egg, not separate anymore from my mother's egg, effectively became the egg. And the future consciousness of the egg, namely the future consciousness of the fertilized egg, when I started growing a head and sucked my thumb as we do, I discovered, babies in their mother's tummy suck their thumbs, and they are conscious of their surroundings. They kick and so forth. So they have consciousness of the womb, and they're quite happy there. So basically, as long as the mother is comfortable, if the mother's uncomfortable, they are uncomfortable. And they kick and so forth. At a later stage, of course. Kick at the walls of the womb. So I'd already discovered that I was conscious before I was born in my mother's womb, in my meditation, but also I went back to my father's testes as that single worm and the unfertilized egg, and my separation in two parts, in part my mother's egg and in part my father's sperm. And then I realized something quite extraordinary. I realized that sperm and that egg depended entirely on what my father and mother ate and drank, and I go on how they slept, how well they slept, how I'm talking about natural sleep rather than at the moment of intercourse. but how they maintained their health. I realized that my health as a sperm depended on my father's health, how he ate and drank and lived. And my health as an egg depended on my mother's health, how she ate and drank and lived, and indeed breathed in both instances. Whether they breathed deeply or shallowly, etc., also has a bearing on health, I subsequently discovered. And so I thought, okay, I want to go back till there's no trace of me. So, and obviously I realized that the sperm has some consciousness when it's swimming towards the egg. It can't see, but it sort of intuitively swims towards the egg together with millions of other sperm. In my mother's fallopian tube, is it? I don't know about the medical science there, but anyhow, as it's swimming towards the egg, it is obviously conscious. It's moving its tail. It has some kind of consciousness. As for the egg, I don't know about whether it has consciousness. Maybe conception is the moment when the sperm and the egg sort of unite, and consciousness in a very rudimentary way begins. I don't know what consciousness there is initially, probably not very much. Probably the sperm, as it were, goes to sleep, just loses the consciousness of that vitality it has swimming towards the egg. And once it loses its tail and its head is just in the egg, does it have consciousness, or does it develop it later? These are secondary questions. Certainly it develops consciousness later. It evolves into a brain, hands and legs, and starts kicking at the walls of the room at a much later stage. But anyhow, I go back to being a single sperm and a single egg, and I thought, okay, what now? I wanted to continue till there's no trace of me, no beginning to me. And I then realized that without on my mother's side, grandparents, Scottish grandparents' genetics, I would not be me. I depended on effectively my grandfather's sperm and my grandmother's egg, which created my mother. So I effectively depended absolutely on my mother as a newly fertilized egg. And before I was fertilized as an egg, I was part of my mother, and was indeed part of my father as that sperm, that single sperm which had just been generated some days earlier. I'm not sure of the precise science of sperm generation. And so I was effectively part of my father, part of my mother. And the quality of that sperm also depended, at least in part, in addition to food and drink and lifestyle of my father, it depended on his genetics as well, in part, whether his parents were strong and he inherited strong genes and so forth. Likewise, my mother, and my mother's lifestyle, I should add, as a child, that her health in later years, when she had conceived me, depended at least in part on her robust health. She was a healthy child as a child and so forth. So going back in time, I thought, okay, so my origins can be found in my grandfather's sperm and my grandfather's egg, which made my mother. And their origins can be found in their grandfather's sperm on both sides, and on one side and their grandmother's egg on the other, etc. And I can go on to my humanoid ancestry and go on to my ape ancestry and go back in time to being a single-celled organism in my fish ancestry, obviously before my ape ancestry, when we all originate from fishes in the sea, and then back in time to a single-celled organism in the sea or by the shore, in puddles by the shore, as I subsequently learnt how the first single-celled organism might have come to be in a puddle and by the shore. And according to one theory. And so I can go back in time before the first single-celled organism. I had learned from one book that at one point the earth was covered by water and with centuries of raging storms of thunder and lightning going on for centuries non-stop at one point. I think because of electromagnetic forces on the earth, etc. Millions or billions of years ago, I think the earth was covered in water. And I went back to the origin of the earth. I wasn't quite sure of the origin of the earth at the time, but back to the origin of the earth 4.5 billion years ago. I've since obviously watched YouTube videos on the origin of the earth, fascinating. And then I thought, okay, went back to the pre-formation of the earth. Apparently, the earth is an offshoot from a star, the sun, or from the sun. So basically, was spit out by the sun as matter from the sun, and went back to the origin of stars, and went all the way back to the Big Bang. And I remember thinking there was no Big Bang, that the Big Bang was not the beginning of the universe, that the Big Bang had to come from something. And I actually, when I thought there is no beginning, the myth of the Big Bang, or the Big Bang is, if true, is just part of something else, that matter and energy that created the Big Bang, the so-called first atom that exploded into a Big Bang. It had to come from something. It didn't come from nothing. Nothing comes from nothing, as the saying says. And that's true, that everything has an origin in something else, I realized. And so I thought, wow, there was no Big Bang. This universe has never, ever, ever had a beginning, I realized. And at that point, I thought, yes, I now understand what the Buddha meant by no birth. And by the way, subsequently, I discovered that's not unique to the Buddha. That some Greek philosophers believed that life has no beginning and no end. Some ancient Greek philosophers believed that life is infinite. I forget which ones, but I think somebody told me that Aristotle believed that. I'm not sure. But certainly I think it's not unique to the Buddha, that some Greek philosophers believe that as well. But anyhow, I remember after I effectively, sitting by the side of the bed, had realized that I had, as it were, cracked the egg of no birth, that I had understood that life never had a beginning. I actually, some days later, wrote to Stephen Hawking, telling him that the Big Bang Theory had to be false because you can't have something from nothing. And anyhow, I was gratified many years later to see a new book by Stephen Hawking called Big Bangs and Baby Universes, plural, and Other Essays, and gratified once again years later to have picked up a book from Tesco called Stardust, The Cosmic Recycling of Stars, Planets and Peoples, at a time when Tesco had a mission to spread some good books around at very cheap prices. Was it Tesco or Asda? I can't remember. But anyhow, I had seen that book called Stardust, The Cosmic Recycling of Stars, Planets and Peoples by John Gribbin, and picked up that book and was very gratified to read in it his theory that there are an infinity of universes connected by, that's a technical astronomical term, wormholes, channels of energy and matter going from one universe to another, creating a new universe, which John Gribbin explains in his book, like an egg being cracked and part of the yolk forms a tiny little other yolk, new yolk. That's how he explains the birth of universes from other universes. And so anyhow, that's how I realized that life, first, never had an end, and secondly, never had a beginning. Well, dear friends, I hope you liked that explanation. By the way, just in case you think, oh, that's not very convincing, you're not alone. I had trouble ever convincing my mum, except weirdly, shortly before she died, when I once again tried to convince her that that life had no beginning and no end. She somehow seemed to find some succor in that. But before she died, we'd have frequent arguments in which she said, you don't know that there's no death, that you don't know that life goes on forever. We just don't know that. So she would very vehemently tell me that I'm talking about things I don't know. And I would make the point that scientifically, I can give her scientific background for this, that there is no death. If you look at it, that matter, energy and consciousness are an infinite continuum. I also used to infuriate her because she has a scientific background. She studied physics and has a degree in physics and had a degree in physics. She passed away some years ago. So, as I mentioned, shortly before her death. So basically, I'd infuriate her by saying, I don't believe that light is the fastest particle. I believe there are infinitely faster particles that we haven't yet detected. That would totally infuriate her because as far as I know, there is no scientist, or there is science now. I've watched YouTube videos. For example, when you consider, but that's an aside, I won't go into that theory that there are infinitely faster particles than light, or waves than light waves, or particles than light particles. But it gave her some kind of succor that shortly before she died, the possibility of being infinitely recycled. We're all 100% recyclable. My younger sister also, shortly before she sadly died of cancer, my younger sister also was not very satisfied. To console you all who are the doubters there, was not very satisfied with the this explanation. She said to me, "Do you mean that the cycle of pain will go on forever?" But the thing is, she was forgetting. I didn't think to tell her then that the cycle of joy also goes on forever. That if we have a capacity for pain that goes on forever in an infinite number of life cycles, we also have a capacity for joy that goes on forever in an infinite number of life cycles. And as far as I know today, the pain and the joy will never stop. And my consolation is the hope, just a hope, that in my future manifestations, bits of me at least, will be part of more and more evolved life. And the difference between non-evolved and evolved life, both suffer pain, but both experience joy. And the joy of both is different only in the subtlety. Like human joys, I can have a lot of joy in solving a chess puzzle, a kind of intellectual joy, or joy in so much in the world that there is to have joy in, shared by animals, and some not shared by animals, such as the joy in a chess puzzle, and so forth. Their joys become more subtle. The joy in a very complex piece of music. Elephants apparently appreciate music, as do other animals. So anyhow, there you are, dear friends. I am pretty convinced, and it would be difficult to persuade me otherwise, though I could be persuaded otherwise, that, I'm very deeply convinced, as I have been in the last 32 years, that life has no beginning and no end. And the conviction is thanks to these two meditations I had at round about Easter holidays, in 3 or 4 day holiday I had in around Easter of 1994, 32 years ago now. Well, dear friends, I hope you found this video useful to you. And if you wish to communicate with me, I guess you could do so in the comments. I could look at the comments for this video. If you wish to communicate what you think of this video, please do so. Please like, and please, normally, by the way, regarding subscribing, this is, I think I did a short video once about no birth and no death, but it wasn't a serious one like this one. It wasn't a long and comprehensive one at all. It was a 5-minute video or something. But if you want to, what just occurs to me is interviews with people about the nature of no birth and no death. I'd love to conduct interviews with people regarding their views on that. People who have sort of, for example, John Gribben, if he's available to talk about this subject, I'd love to interview him about that, as he's already persuaded that in his book, Stardust, the Cosmic Recycling of Stars, Planets and Peoples, I'm pretty sure he is already on to the fact that life is infinite. And interview particularly people who believe that life is infinite and get their perspective on how they discovered that and so forth. Anyhow, this will be part of my regular YouTube channel, which is basically I tend to upload daily videos on my current philosophy of life, which is to seek to be aware of the infinity of life within me and all around me, and to encourage others to do the same. And I upload daily shorts, which are like between 30 seconds to 2 minutes long, seeking to encourage people to do so. So here I can say what I can guarantee, not guarantee, there's no guarantee, but for the past 2 or 3 months, I've been uploading daily YouTube shorts about seeking to be aware of the infinity of life within me and all around me, and encouraging others to do the same. If you would be interested in these shorts, maybe you could subscribe. Certainly, if you like this video, if you press the like button icon, that will help other people enjoy this video, enjoy the content of this video, hopefully help other people realize that life is infinite, without beginning and without end, and that consciousness, that matter, energy, and consciousness are an infinite continuum. If you've stayed for the whole of this 45 minutes, thank you so much. I am very, very grateful to you for having given me this time. And I wish you a great life, a great day, and a great life. And I hope that you too can enjoy the infinity of life within you and all around you. Thank you, dear friend. Thank you so much.